read the episode title. It's about the goddamn Beatles. Why did I want to talk about the goddamn Beatles? Well, I suppose since this has become just me on the podcast, there used to be another guy, Steven. We love him. He had to go do dad stuff, so it's just me now. The format, when there's not a guest, which frequently there isn't because I don't remember to book them, and I'm very antisocial to begin with, even though there are many people I would love to book on this show, I just don't put in the effort. So I have to now mine these like big parts of my personality, find out what is it exactly that makes me tick. And if I were to come down to one thing, it's the Beatles. It's who saw Inside Out? Everyone saw Inside Out. I'm of course making reference to a children's movie, but of course the Beatles are sort of children's music in a way, so I feel it's appropriate. We're often introduced to them as children, but yeah, for a lot of us, you just hear the Beatles really early at age 6, and that's it. You're Beatles forever. There's some quality about their music which is able to get into their minds of very young people. You know, it's like hard to understand Steely Dan when you're 6 years old, but you can sing Bungalow Bill when you're 6 years old. You know, you can't sing fucking Black Cow. You know, what 6-year-old understands Black? I want to meet the 6-year-old that understands Black Cow. He's probably weird. Or she. Who knows? Who knows? But yeah, actually, no. There was that video footage of the TikTok going around of, like, the small girl child who liked Michael McDonald a lot, and that was very endearing. So yeah, who knows what kids like? Who the fuck knows? If you have a Steely Dan child, though, that's sort of unnerving. It's okay. It's okay to have a Beatles child. But yeah, in Inside Out. Remember in Inside Out, if you've ever seen it, you have these islands of personality of what composes a person. And in the movie, the little child, she likes hockey. And, you know, that composes an essential part of her personality. Or her goofiness composes. That's an island of her personality. And I feel like, for me, the Beatles composes a lot of that. Just so much of my mind is occupied by the Beatles at any one time. Just got it hooked into me really early. And there was something about it which forever colored my view of art and, you know, what is good, and, you know, is whimsy or fantasy good? You know, what are my political alignments as a result of the Beatles? Because you can get into a lot of stuff through them, because there were 4 guys who each contained multitudes. Each were interesting in their own sort of way. Even though they had the same voice, they didn't actually have the same voice. I can do them all now. I learned it from Jess Harnell, who did Wacko Warner, which was a composite character of all the Beatles. But all the Beatles are slightly different. You know, they all got their own personality. The smart one, the cute one, the quiet one, and Ringo, who I guess was the funny one. Even though they were all kind of funny. That was part of it as well. But John, he's sort of nasal in his nose there, and he's sort of harsh and disturbing. Well, Paul is up here. He's just a whimsical little elf guy, and, you know, he's going around. I love nature. You know, I just wish we could explore our feelings in a way. I've done acid lots of times. You know, 4 times I've done acid. George is off here somewhere. He's sort of got a mid-voice in the corner. You know, he's there on his sitar, learning about Love You Too. And Ringo is down here, of course. Every day we get older and wiser, and nobody knows. And I can't do Ringo as well because I don't have that naturally deep voice. But those are all the Beatles there. If you ever wanted to differentiate the Beatles, there's sort of there's the high Beatle, Paul. There's the 2 mid Beatles who are sort of off in harshness. John is harsh mid, and George is mellow mid, and of course Ringo is the lower one. And that's all you need to know about the hierarchy of the Beatles. Yeah, I think that's part of it too, where they all have their individual legacies, and you can map your personality onto one of them. You know, choosing which Beatle you enjoy the most, or which you identify with the most, is akin to choosing your starting Pokemon. It is a very significant choice. It displays whether you're a sap or, in my mind, the Looney Tunes director, Chuck Jones, Bob Clampett, and Tex Avery. That's a very important choice in every cartoonist's mind. But for the Beatles, I gotta say I'm a Paul guy. I go back and forth year after year for the same reason I like Chuck Jones. I just, I like the cuteness. I like the whimsy of it. I think there are lots of reasons why people are annoyed with the Beatles, chief of which is the political hypocrisy of John Lennon, maybe, and the whimsy. That if you don't like whimsy, if you don't like the sort of bleary-eyed fantasy world of the English, then this isn't for you. You're never going to like that. But there is a quality to English music, going all the way back to, I mean, in the 20th century, you had people like Benjamin Britten or like Edward Elgar, or even like Gustav Holst, who is, he is an English composer, even though I think he's an English composer. Let me look that up real quick. Got to look up Holst real quick, even though he has he is an English composer, even though he has a non-English name. He is actually an English composer. But going all the way back, in time to like Henry Purcell, that's what's interesting about English classical music, is that there's this huge gap in time between relevance of English composers. Like you have in the 16th and 17th centuries, you have this. You have people like Purcell who are doing their music on their harpsichords and their virginals, and it's this very early classical music. And who is the Cold Song by? I love the Cold Song. That's I first heard it of Klaus Nomi's version, but that is from the King Arthur opera, the 17th century King Arthur opera, which was by Henry Purcell, and I really love the Cold Song. But yeah, even back then, and from that big gap in time of relevance of English composers in the classical canon, basically until Elgar, basically until the 19th century, there were composers that made their name in England, like Handel, but yeah, very few English composers for some reason during that time. And there were also, for some reason into the 20th century, guys like Percy Aldrich Granger as well. But there was something noted, and maybe why they weren't taken seriously at the height of Romanticism, but there is sort of like a quality to English music which is sweet and treacly and catchy. That's the weird part of sort of the general quality of music. That's not all music produced on that weird island, but as a general course, there seems to be a melancholic obsession with fantasy because it is overcast all the time. You're always just looking out your window with a little cup of tea and thinking, oh, wouldn't it be nice if I escaped into a world of fantasy? So that sort of general quality, but also like that pop quality, that like thing that Holst had, if you've ever listened to The Planets, where it's like these really catchy melodies for some reason. They have that, it's really zippy. It stays in your head. It's, not these sort of long explorations of like form and technical mathematical ability like Bach or like even Haydn, or like these big expressions of texture like Berlioz. It's these real catchy riffs, even expressed in the folk compilations of Percy Aldrich Granger. I dare you to hear The Lost Lady Found and not be humming bum 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 bum. Yeah, so that pop sensibility is like thoroughly endowed in the English spirit for the the reasons I mentioned. That sort of like, oh, we're constantly beset by Vikings, and we hate our world because they're just clouds. They're just clouds over us and our sky is grey, but really there could be fantasy and nice sugar pies on the windows. And so if you don't like that quality, if you're instantly repelled by that quality, you're never going to like the fucking Beatles. I, for one, understand that melancholic sweetness, that melancholic sentimentality. I, for one, am imbued with it. I don't know what it is. I just enjoy it. I like the sort of, I think it carries forth into enjoying shit like Lord of the Rings as well, or Terry Pratchett, or Neil Gaiman, all of which I have enjoyed. And you know, you can feel like, you fucking nerd, yeah, sorry. You know, I'm into that fucking stuff. Or Doctor Who. Doctor Who is super emblematic of that. And, you know, the king of that shit is fucking Paul McCartney. You know, all of the other Beatles, you know, you want to say that all the other Beatles aren't as whimsical as Paul, but all the Beatles are pretty fucking whimsical. They're all like, they all got the, oh, what if we lived in a better world of, you know. John used different metaphors, but it was still that same, you know, intense longing for a world outside of yourself. A world outside of sort of this narrow vaulted dome that the clouds have formed around you if you're living on this gray island. And Liverpool's like that, you know, talk about that weather, you know, forming around you, and that's what sort of colors your perception of things. But yeah, of course that sentimentality is in all the Beatles. Look at Strawberry Fields and fucking Penny Lane, where Paul McCartney and and John Lennon were trying to out-sentimental each other into who can John, who do you think can conjure the best childhood memories? And John's like, my childhood memories will be deeper and more sensuous, while yours will be a set of Paddington Bear-like imagery. And Paul will be like, well, mine is just as relevant as yours. And say, eventually we will come to blows ideologically. So you know, to pretend like John Lennon was the more deeply serious Beatle, I always feel is exaggerated, because he's got his moments of the English sweetness. I mean, constantly like Paul, but he would also write songs about beating your wife, you know, and then he, you know, that's the other thing that people, of course, I should bring up immediately. Is that's one of the all-time facts that people who are trying to spoil the Beatles for you is, oh, you know, John Lennon beat his wife. You know, John Lennon beat Yoko. Of course, he was fucked up. You know, he was fucked up with Cynthia Lennon as well. He was, you know, fucked up with his children. But, you know, I don't think he was like, you know, that shit is in the regular realm of fucked up. And I think if you become the most famous person in the world, like, you don't understand, like, my incredibly small, tiny amount of Twitter fame, like, makes me megalomaniacal on many occasions where I shouldn't be. I absolutely shouldn't be. But if you are literally, like, the most famous person in the world, like Michael Jackson levels famous, and it doesn't fuck with you a little bit, you know, not saying that, you know, obviously John Lennon had agency over his actions and, you know, what he did was bad, but I think ultimately, and, you know, that underscores the tragedy of his death, is, you know, he came out of the 80s, you know, he beat heroin, you know, he was sort of free of a lot of vices. He seemed to have mellowed out and sobered up and gotten sort of nicer, and, you know, that's when he gets shot, of course. And, you know, I think that sort of comes through in the Double Fantasy album, which is a mellow as hell album. It was a very easy listening album. You know, Double Fantasy is fine. I like it's not my favorite of the John Lennon solo projects. It's very lots of dreamy, cheesy reverb, which is fine. I like, you know, I can't say I hate cheese, but I love Paul McCartney. But that's also what I'm saying, is John Lennon is a cheesy guy. You're gonna get cheese with John Lennon, no matter how you slice it. And Double Fantasy, I believe, was his form yet to come of ultra cheesy John Lennon. And I sort of am very sad that we never got to see more of ultra cheesy John Lennon, because I like that shit. I would have liked to have seen more like sax solos. Like, had John Lennon got on to make another album in the vein of Double Fantasy, there would have been crazier sax solos. I just know it. I just know that would have occurred, hopefully. But I really like, I think the reason why I like Paul is because, to me, the spirit of the Beatles has always been that, like, get lost in sort of this insular fantasy of your own creation that's cobbled together from the memories of the intrinsic geographical memories of your childhood. I think the figures of the local figures of Liverpool loom large in their mythology, and that's what sort of makes it so lived in and real. Even though it's a fantasy, it is an urban fantasy. In fact, as I just last episode I was talking about, a couple episodes ago I was talking about what tickled my gourd in terms of JRPGs and urban fantasy, and it's the same thing with the Beatles. I just realized it's this sort of world where this vague magic exists, but within the terrible backdrop of Liverpool. But there's always a yellow submarine just around your shoulder, ready, the magical mysteries, waiting to take you away. Which is a very scary sentiment, frankly. I don't like anything where they're, like, coming to take me away. And that lyric, I guess, has embedded itself in my head for years to come, because they're coming to take you away. Take you today! That's one of the more disliked Beatles album is the Magical Mystery Tour album, along with the Yellow Submarine soundtrack album. I want to defend both of those if I can. They're actually some of my favorite Beatles albums. I'm just gonna start out. That's how I'll start out right away. Controversy. I actually really like both Magical Mystery Tour and the Yellow Submarine soundtrack album. Obviously, Magical Mystery Tour, less reviled than the Yellow Submarine soundtrack album because it's pretty solid. Everybody sort of enjoys the back half, which is just a compilation of their very best singles at the time. But I really like the front half, too. I like the goofy, theatrical sort of quality of that. I also, I saw that movie when I was way too young, and I did not understand it, but it held my attention. I guess I like these two because they're associated with movies I liked that I watched as a kid. I watched all the Beatles movies as a kid because, that's parents liked. And I didn't really understand Hard Day's Night as much because there's something about it that's not as kid-friendly because even though it's a fantasy, it's more grounded and it takes place in reality. Whereas Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine are just straight up fantasies and cartoons, basically. So one is a literal cartoon and one is a live action cartoon. But I really liked it as a sort of enjoyer of that 60s, 70s sort of psychedelic animation style. Also contemporary to that time was stuff like The Point, which I really enjoyed as a kid, which of course Ringo Starr was all over, or Halloween is Grinch Night, the shit that that's the type of like animation that really ingrained itself in my, or like the Phantom Toll Booth or something like that. That's the shit that really got into my head as a kid, and I consider Yellow Submarine and Magical Mystery Tour as sort of a piece with those films somehow, at least in terms of childhood core, Alex. Childhood core is a terrible word that I'm sure has already been coined, but I also just spontaneously thought of it now. But yeah, let's start with Magical Mystery Tour. Let's start with these sort of these more overlooked Beatles albums, because everyone knows, the fucking White Album and Abbey Road and Sgt. Pepper's, but who thinks of Magical Mystery Tour is the first Beatles album they think of? I really, I guess, part of why I like Paul too is because he's easier to understand as a kid, or like the depth of Paul is easier to sort of grasp. I mean, not really, but take an emotional song like For No One, compared to sort of the deeper material that John was writing at the time. Not I'm Only Sleeping. That's a song I really liked as a kid because it's like, John wrote a song about how he's so sleepy. But say like a John Sadness song from that era was hey, you've got to hide your love away, which for some reason held my attention less as a kid than something is sort of a much simpler sentiment in a way as for no one. And I guess that's sort of what Paul was good for, writing these things that could be articulated to literally everyone. It's why, my first memory of a concert as a child was being 3 years old and my dad taking me to a freaking Wings concert. And I was into it. I remember being into it as a kid, even though I didn't recognize any of the Paul McCartney solo songs, because I recognized Band on the Run, maybe. Or maybe I'm exaggerating this. I have no real memories from when I was 3, but I remember being taken to a freaking Wings concert. But yeah, we got Magical Mystery Tour. We got Your Mother Should Know, which I'm always, humming to myself. It's the dumbest, most insubstantial Beatles songs, but somehow it is the dumbest, most insubstantial Beatles songs that hold my attention and get into my head the most, which is also one of their wonderful qualities. Even the fucking shit suck Beatles that you fucking hate, like Bungalow Bill, it's like you're just humming to yourself merrily, hey, Bungalow Bill. I love that shit. It's so good. And Your Mother Should Know that. Let's all get up and dance to a song. Come on. You gotta love this. If you don't like spats, if you don't like walking down a staircase slowly in a white tuxedo with your boys, you're not gonna enjoy this. But frankly, I enjoy both of those things. We need more spats in this world. I guess what I was also going to articulate about the simplistic emotional world of Paul McCartney was the second track on the album, or the one that, as I had it, was The Fool on the Hill, which is like, as a kid, because of that very direct, sentimentality, that sort of EastEnders style sentimentality, that, oh no, we're looking over a hill and everyone thinks I'm stupid, but really, I'm the smartest one of all. That's how I felt, as an arrogant child, It's like, oh, I'm an arrogant little gay child. I am the fool on the hill. Everyone is mocking me. But really, they are the ones that don't understand. I am the ones with my head in the clouds, day after day. And it has that really Hobbit-like flute theme. Boop, 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 boop. I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know what it is about that shit, but it's like, I love that goofy shit so much. I don't know what it is. I love that goofy shit so much, which is why Paul is my favorite Beatle. I guess as you've experienced if Ween is one of my favorite bands, obviously I love that goofy shit so much. That's actually what I wanted to say. Another thing I wanted to say about Ween. Ween is like the Beatles if the only two songwriters were both Paul McCartney, which I enjoy. Definitely I will always gravitate towards the goofiest Beatle. Of course I will. Which, some people think is Ringo. And Ringo's pretty goofy, but he didn't write a lot of songs. And, the songs he's featured on are, fine. So it's hard to measure him up to the other Beatles in terms of which songs I really enjoy. And, as everyone knows, the Lennon-McCartney songs are credited to both of them. But you can kind of tell which one of them. Sometimes they wrote songs as a duo, like Getting Better, where Paul McCartney, he wrote the song Getting Better. Oh, it's this song really needs something to spice it up. And John Lennon was like, how about a lyric where you used to beat your woman? And it's like, all right, okay. That was the collaboration on Getting Better. I hope I'm not lying about that. I think that's an actual true story. That's the lyric that John Lennon contributed to one, which was the weirdly out of place with this song of this very merry McCartney song, getting so much better. Out of the middle, it gets really serious. So, the little sitar that they have going on the background rings out, and he says, I used to be cruel to my woman, I beat her and kept her apart from the... Whoa! It just right into the woman beating right there. And, that's... of course, we all know the Beatles' misogyny songs. We all know Run for Your Life off of Rubber Soul. You better run for your life if you can, little girl. Hide your head in the sand, little girl. Catch you with another man, that's it. I am going to hunt you. I'm John Lennon, and I'm hunting you down with a knife. which also dovetails back into. Didn't you know John Lennon beat his? Yeah, and he also wrote a song. He also wrote some problematic songs as well. But I guess the reason why people point out John Lennon's problematic songs as well is because there's a view that he was hypocritical, a view that he espoused a sort of high-minded political philosophy while just sort of being a rich gadabout. Which, sure, how much have any of us done? And I'm sure the bet in, he seems sort of like hippie-ish and obnoxious, but frankly, he was speaking out against Vietnam in a time where doing so could get you fucked with, and Nixon did fuck with him for it, so there were repercussions to his somewhat seemingly nowadays ineffectual activism, but it meant something. It sort of meant something. I'm not saying it was totally effectual or anything, or like it raised awareness to the degree that it ended the war or something like that. But it's not as inconsequential in action as people might think, given historical context. I guess it's just sort of annoying because people also find John Lennon, they also associate him with hippies, and they just find hippies generally or vaguely annoying. And they associate him with the Two Virgins album cover of him and Yoko nude, and then I see photoshopped images of their ass cracks getting larger, which is kind of funny. Yeah, and people are also, why not? I'm just committing to this sort of rambly, free associative style of talking about the Beatles. I'll talk about fucking Yoko. I like Yoko. Yoko is cool, dude. And she's the lay off of Yoko. People say she broke up the Beatles. She did not break up the Beatles. Brian Epstein dying broke up the Beatles because they lost the Jewish gay guy that was holding them together. That was the secret to their success. They had a Jewish gay guy, just like Scooter Braun with Justin Bieber. I don't know what Scooter Braun did. People are driving him as a talent agent. It seems like he did some nefarious stuff. But, I don't know what Brian Epstein did. I hope Brian Epstein didn't do some nefarious stuff. But he tragically died in 1967, which sent the Beatles into tumult, and they were all trying to get their own managers in, and that's really what ended them way more than Yoko. Like, Yoko just happened to be there at the wrong time, and she was associated with what people saw as John Lennon's turn towards a more pretentious or obnoxious style of expression, further away from a pop sensibility and more towards a sort of experimental art quality. And people think that's, lamentable because it results in stuff like Revolution 9 on the White Album, which is a track that some people skip. They're not into sound collages. I personally think it's a great fucking sound collage. I love Revolution 9. It's fantastic because somehow they've done like experimental style like Stockhausen music, and they all knew about Stockhausen. They were like, yes, we've heard Stockhausen. Yeah, we know about Stockhausen. We've definitely heard that before. So they're doing these experiments with music at the time, and they managed to capture that quality of the English sweetness, but in this experimental sound collage, where it's what are the sounds that John Lennon chooses? Children playing in the distance, little BBC jazz riffs that he probably heard on the radio as a child. All these sort of melancholic, childish musings. Back to this sort of wistful time when fantasy was more easily accessible, which is, I think, part of why you enjoy it as a child. I've got a long way off from Magical Mystery Tour, but let's talk about, speaking of John and John's sense of whimsy, and what I feel like when John did whimsy, he really showed up, because he did I Am the Walrus, which is fucking great. I fucking love I Am the Walrus. Fuck you if you don't like I Am the Walrus. It's a great song. He's the walrus. He's the Eggman. Goo Goo Gajoob, which allegedly, according to legend, he wrote this song as a troll. because he realized, they're analyzing a song lyric. They're analyzing my song lyrics in schools. That's sort of stupid. They shouldn't be analyzing the Beatles lyrics. So I'm just going to do a bunch of surrealistic imagery, and they can have at it analyzing that. Sitting on the cornflake, that's dumb. I'll put it on there. And unwittingly, in his sneering arrogance, he managed to cobble together a series of fantastic, wonderful images that I love to this very day, and I loved as a kid. Even sort of the slightly horror ones, like yellow matter custard dripping from a dead dog's eye. And even, in this attempt at surrealism, he still lands on these sort of hallmarks of English sweetness somehow. Yeah, people like to think of Paul McCartney as the corny Beatle versus, no, they were all corny. They were all very corny men. They were all very sentimental guys. That is the secret of the Beatles. That is the hidden secret of all knowledge and the Beatles. Of course, there are, Flying, which is a track in the middle. It's just an instrumental track, but loved it as a kid because it's got that stupid theatrical quality. Blue Jay Way, sort of spooky. I liked Blue Jay Way. That's all I have to say about Blue Jay Way, really, is sort of spooky. That was George's contribution. And yeah, in the back half, it has Penny Lane and All You Need Is Love and Baby You're a Rich Man, and all these, fantastic tracks right at the end of the Baby You're a Rich Man is going back to Brian Epstein, may have been written about Brian Epstein, and John Lennon is alleged to have tormented, made his jokes. It's like, you're a gay Jew, Brian Epstein. And there are some takes where it's a baby, you're a rich man too. John Lennon would say, baby, you're a rich F-slur Jew. about Brian Epstein. I don't know if this is true or not. I shouldn't be saying this, but it's probably the reason why Brian Epstein took his own. No, he didn't take his own life. I think he OD'd. I think that was the cause of his death. Which is sad, but that's sort of my overview of Magical Mystery Tour. Less hard to defend. I don't know if anyone will call it their favorite Beatles album, but definitely the Yellow Submarine soundtrack is the hardest to defend Beatles album, because it contains a couple songs that have appeared on other albums, and then a bunch of the George Martin incidental music, which for some reason receives poor reviews from people. But I don't know. I always thought it was sort of great. Everyone has who is the fifth Beatle. There are so many people who are the fifth Beatle. Stu Sutcliffe, Billy Preston. But George Martin, of course, is a guy that comes up with it. So much of the Beatles sound is defined by his string composition, which I think, I mentioned the classical tradition of like Elgar and Holst, but I think, that's what he was really borrowing from. And that is the sound which really defines a lot of the Beatles composition. I mean, even going back to Purcell, think about In My Life, how that fucking harpsichord, actually it's not a harpsichord in My Life, it's a sped up piano that's made to sound like a harpsichord, which is I don't know why they did that instead of using a harpsichord, but that's the studio trick, it sounds better this way somehow, and it does. It sounds great. So you have those musical cues that get filtered through this even treaclier pop sensibility for the incidental soundtrack music in the Yellow Submarine movie. But I don't know, maybe it's just because I watched it as a kid and it burned into my brain. I'm sure that's a big reason for it. But I fucking love the incidental treacly ass George Martin soundtrack music. And I love the back half of Yellow Submarine as a result of it. And you know what? Some of these songs are often touted as the worst Beatles songs. People don't like Only a Northern Song. I think Only a Northern Song is one of my favorite fucking Beatles songs of all time. I'll go out on a limb for Only a Northern Song. I'm crazy about this goddamn fucking song. I think it's fucking cool as hell. You know, I was speaking before about how I enjoyed the Beatles' approach to sound collages and stuff like that, because they managed to even somehow bring a pop sensibility, that sort of catchiness and sentimentality, to this, you know, real free jazz. Also, this free jazz sensibility as well, which I thought was really cool, and is you know, that sort of jazzy, you know, wailing trumpet quality is no more apparent than on Only a Northern Song, and it sort of prefigures my enjoyment of stuff like, you know, Sun Ra and Albert Ayler, because I'm sure just hearing that fucking crazy ass dissonant trumpet was like, ooh, I sort of like this. Something about this is getting to me at a core level. And or like the plinking celestas that are in the background, and I really like the cacophony of it. I always thought that George Harrison crafted a really good fucking cacophony there, a really pop forward catchy cacophony. And I sort of like the melody about how it's you know, this sounds wrong. You know, it sort of it presents to you the challenge of unlistenable music at an early age, which I thought is a very sort of cool thing to do for George Harrison. And George Harrison would later, you know, go on to create lots of fantastic unlistenable electronic music, like Wonderwall music, big walls of sound off of the weird Zapple records, which I think only had 2 releases, both of which were noise releases, which are really cool. Listen to George Harrison's noise work. Listen to John Lennon's noise. They made noise music. It's cool that, like, these massive, you know, the Taylor Swifts of their time, in their off time, you know, when they're doing solo stuff, made fucking noise music. You know, you may hate the Beatles, you think they're uncool or treacly, but they were they really liked music. They really appreciated the music. They didn't just do one thing. That, you know, so that was cool of them, and I like that filtered into Only a Northern Song, and I like, 'cause it's only a northern song. I liked it. I like the melody. I love Hey Bulldog. I love It's All Too Much. George Harrison gets 2 fucking great songs, because they, you know, it's like, oh, who cares about this fucking cartoon movie soundtrack? We'll give George a couple of songs, and they're both great. They're both fantastic George songs. I love both of them. I love It's All Too Much. Of course, altogether now, one of the more annoying Beatles songs. I still like it a lot, but that's, you know, talk about one you can understand as a kid. You know, that I think that one was made expressly for the children who they assumed would be watching this movie because it was a cartoon, and they were right. I can talk about I'll talk about the Yellow Submarine movie, because I really fucking love that movie. The designs of Heinz Edelman are unparalleled. I forget who the animation director on is. I remember he was a Canadian fella, George something. I should get his name right, because he was also very important to the success of that movie. George Dunning. It was a Canadian fella, George Dunning. It's just, yeah, constantly surrounded by Georges. The history of the Beatles is a history of various Georges, but it's a beautiful movie, and sort of captured, I'm sure, defined my future taste for movies. I sort of like movies which are just a series of vignettes, you know, which have a loose plot connecting them, but there's sort of just this series of scenes which are connected in sort of this fantastical quality, which is sort of, you know, that's sort of the natural format of these Beatle movies up to this point, where all of a sudden there would be a break in the movie where you'd have this surreal performance section. They always had that sort of vignette-like quality, but that, you know, filters into my love of movies like The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie by Buñuel, or, you know, other Buñuel stuff probably colored my love of surrealism, or, you know, even The Beach Bum by Harmony Korine. I'm sure the vignette style of the loosely connected Shaggy Dog vignette style was influenced by my early love of that sort of loose style of this movie. where there's a plot. They got to stop the Blue Meanies, who are Nazis. At one point in the movie, Max says we could go to Argentina, which is very funny that the Blue Meanies, they're Nazis, and they're taking the gray out of the world. The Beatles got to return the color to Pepperland through music, through harmony, as is usually the thing. I love that's the stock plot of your music theater. Your music film, which is like, oh no, there's someone who's preventing us from rocking, and we must use rock to stop it. That's like 2112, where the temples of Syrinx are preventing us from rocking. We must use rock. Or that was the Abandon Who Lifehouse project, where it's like the powers that be are stopping us from rocking. Or I'm sure that was, I think that's a bunch of Styx is like, they're stopping us from rocking. So yeah, and but School of Rock, they're stopping us from, sometimes you just need to fucking rock out, or in the Beatles' case, do nice sort of circusy harmonies, in order to restore the color to Pepperland and stop these nefarious Blue Meanies. I think the sort of the sequence at the beginning where everyone's getting turned to stone is fucking horrifying. I hated that shit as a kid. Getting turned into a statue, one of my least favorite. I hated that shit when I saw that shit in Lion, the Witch in the Wardrobe, and I hated it when it happened in Yellow Submarine. I don't like the idea of being turned into a statue. It is a metaphor for paralysis. All of those statues were aware. They were sentient. It's terrible. I guess it's also a metaphor for, of course, the depression as well, I suppose. But also they're Nazis. They're depression Nazis. They're goofy, queer-coded depression. I don't know if they're queer-coded, but I like the idea that Max and the head Blue Meanie are fucking. He has this little John Waters mustache, Maybe that's why I like the blue. Yeah, no, they're queer-coded. Yeah, they're definitely queer-coded. He's always lisping like him from Powerpuff Girls. So maybe that's also why I enjoyed it, because they eventually befoul a gay villain, but the gay villain is forgiven in the end, and he is allowed to participate in the end psychedelic jam of It's All Too Much, which is nice, He is not discarded, even though it was implied he was sort of Nazi-like. We don't need to analyze this movie any further. Actually, there's a lot of body horror elements to Yellow Submarine. Also, the scene where they're all aging rapidly in the sea of time, I always found distressing. And they're dancing around with their beards. I always found that. It's like, no, I don't want them to die. If they keep aging, they're going to die. For some reason, that was the first thought in my childhood mind. But I guess, that's sort of why I like the movie, too. You always like, some of those classical animated movies where there's more apparent peril. There's more, disturbing shit because they weren't thinking about how disturbing it was. They were just like, sure, kids like this, whatever. Nowadays, I think we think more about what is going to be traumatic to children before we write stuff. But back in the day, you just had Roald Dahl being like, yeah, a bunch of kids get fucking horribly mutilated in a fucking chocolate factory. Fuck it. And we loved it as kids because, it's like, yay. I understand violence. In old Looney Tunes cartoons, you just see Sylvester just putting a gun to his fucking head all the time. And I watched that as a kid. And I was like, yeah, it's fine. I'm not traumatized by that. So what I'm saying is we need more cartoon characters threatening suicide. And that's what I ultimately come out of this. But I just wanted to rep the Yellow Submarine, an unpopular choice in the Beatles camp. Not my favorite Beatles. If I'm being honest, neither Yellow Submarine nor Magical Mystery Tour are my favorite Beatles albums. But if I had to say which one was my favorite album, it's sort of a toss-up between Abbey Road and Rubber Soul. What I like about Rubber Soul is it's that perfect bridge between their early sound or their later sound. Revolver is, I feel fully engrossed in that later sound. Some people say Revolver is that bridge, but I think I like that sort of more pop quality of not pop quality, but it's like, so who are the Beatles' big influences? Like Elvis, Little Richard, the Everly Brothers. More than anything else, I think the Beatles were copying, more from their skiffle roots. They were just copying the Everly Brothers, like these really sort of up-tempo, especially in their early days, these up-tempo pop songs with these really tight harmonies. That was the that was the game. And so at Rubber Soul, they're at their most Everly Brothers, in a certain way, or they had sort of perfected that Everly Brothers style of songcraft, which I think is evident in "I'm looking to you, where did you go?" Or all the Paul songs are fucking. "You Won't See Me" as well as I feel like sort of the Britishification of that Everly Brothers craft, but that's still that root of the up tempo, tight harmonies, really sort of simplistic, fragmentary melodies that are easy to catch on to. That's sort of the root of a lot of them. If I were to single out one influence as to who I think the Beatles are most influenced by, it would be them, which I think they would say in their casual admission. Also, everybody, all the rocks, Buddy Holly, they loved. Who doesn't love Buddy? I'm sure, Phil Spector, who they eventually worked with, who was a problematic guy, Phil Spector, but we love him anyway. I mean, I love all of Phil Spector's old music. Can't beat that shit. Can't beat that Wall of Sound shit. Can't beat the Ronettes. But he did murder a woman. So we'll chastise him for that. How come you don't, you say you like the Beatles, everyone brings up John Lennon. John Lennon beat his wife. No one says Phil Spector, also tangentially associated with the Beatles. Phil Spector killed a woman. No one brings that up. How come? How come they always focus on John not killing? I don't know why I'm doing this. I'm digging myself a hole. Yeah, John Lennon did bad stuff, but I hope to God we are more than just the worst things that we do, right? It's sort of, I don't know if the things that he did are within the realm of forgiveness for you. No one can forgive him except for the people he did that shit to. So I don't really care about it. I think it hasn't, and everyone draws a line of separating art from the artist, right? Sometimes there are things that people do that are too bad that will forever color your view of that art. You can't listen to that Rock and Roll Part 2 song the same way. I guess unless it's good enough, you can just be Michael Jackson, and you can have the most horrible allegations leveled against you in the world, and I'll listen to "Wanna Be Starting Something," and it's still good. I don't know why I can put it out of my mind for Michael Jackson. The songs are too good. I'm sorry about those kids, but I'm sorry. I shouldn't be going down this train, but I think that's true. We all sort of dither about what is okay and wasn't okay when we analyze the biography of an artist versus their art, and I think it's okay to do that. I think people are like, oh, you have to be death of the author, or you have to be like, you have to cancel people if they've done anything wrong. It's just like, I don't know, you could sort of pick and choose. I mean, it's you can, it's okay to be sort of inconsistent with that shit, in my view, because I want to believe, and I don't know if this is true, this is an ongoing debate, but that art, there's a sort of place called the art space, which it's sort of this extra dimensional world where our thoughts can be sublimated into expression, and through that expression we can create a better composite of what we are feeling. And what we are feeling is not intrinsic to us. What we are feeling is a combination of what we're feeling, but also what we're pulling out from the world. Frequently someone like Mozart, or I was reading about Kawabata Makoto of Acid Mother's Temple today, but they describe the process of making music as if the melodies exist already in the atmosphere and you're just plucking them out of the atmosphere. So I think that sort of communing with the sort of collective unconscious, as I don't know if I'd use that phrase exactly, but it is always a conversation between you and literally everyone else in the entire world and who you're influenced by. That is sort of the great beauty of art. So in sublimating your thoughts like that, you can kind of ascend to the art space in some ways, and your personality or your personal failings don't matter as much compared to, you know, the feelings that you were able to extract from the universe at large. You know, you were a medium for that exercise, and you may have been an imperfect medium, but you may have succeeded at conveying that emotional quality, that universal emotional quality that we all strive for. And I think, you know, John Lennon, by all evidence, achieved it, even in spite of his failings. So, you know, and, you know, I struggled with that at first. Of course, oh, your favorite guy, he did something fucked up. And when you first start thinking about that shit at, like, when you're a teenager in your late teen years or in college, it's like, oh no, the guy I like did something fucked up. And then as you get older, you're like, yeah, I don't care. You know, it was pretty fucked up, but it wasn't like that fucked, which is something you say to yourself a lot as you start dithering on the art you like. So who knows? Who knows what's right? I'm not one to suggest. And this has barely been about the Beatles, but more about a philosophical understanding of the Beatles. And I guess that's what we're also here to talk about. But yeah, Rubber Soul and Abbey Road. Back to Rubber Soul. But Rubber Soul also represents an evolution in style because it featured the first ever Beatles song that wasn't about romantic love. Every Beatles song up to that point had been about, oh, you're a lady and I want you, you're a lady and you're a girl. And This Rubber Soul was the first album to feature it featured Nowhere Man, which is about John Lennon's isolation, which of course I understood as a child from the Yellow Submarine movie is about being a furry another queer-coded guy, Jeremy Allen Boob, you know, Jeremy Hillary Boob, PhD. I don't know. I said Jeremy Allen Boob, Jeremy Hillary Boob, another gay character in the Beatles lineup of gay characters. I thought he was the Nowhere Man, but of course, you know, he is a representation of this sort of academic isolation that I think John Lennon was sort of getting at. But, you know, who doesn't feel like the Nowhere Man? Also, just gorgeous harmonies in that fucking song. Those opening harmonies, which apparently the Beatles had a really hard time doing. They were very hard to pull off live. Like, you can see them in Japan, and they're trying to do the Nowhere Man harmonies, and they're sweating. In old stock footage of them. But, so I really like the fuzz guitar on Think For Yourself and sort of that groovy mid-60s bongos quality of it. But, fucking Drive My Car, which I loved as a kid because I would always go beep, 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 beep. Yeah, good at Paul McCartney. He writes songs that a 6-year-old can understand, and I still understand them, and I still love them deeply. For some reason, even though they have this sort of childlike quality, they don't, seem juvenile. They seem like something that I can still enjoy as an adult for whatever reason. It had Norwegian Wood, which I was too young to understand what that was about. But that had a sitar in it. They were moving on in instrumentation. They were gone with the days of just the old guitar rhythm section setup, and now they had instruments from the mysterious East as well. I should also, I don't know if there's ever been talk about it. I don't know how much scholarship, I should look in, I'm sure there's plenty of been written on it, but I wonder if there's criticism of sort of a colonial aspect to George Harrison's love of India. I think there hasn't been because from all evidence, it seems like his scholarship was genuine and deeply felt, and not a sort of exploratory in a exploitative way, but one in like a deeply curious way. And the sort of the Indian influenced Beatles songs fucking slap. They're fucking great. I'm sorry. Within You, Without You. Love You Too. They're fucking cool. The Inner Light, sure, I'll cape for the Inner Light. It's good. Without going out of my door, I can know all ways of heaven. I believe this. I sit on my couch and listen to the Beatles, and now I know all ways of heaven. The farther one travels, the less one knows. The perfect song for the couch potato. I'm sure there's deeper meaning to that, but I think whatever else it enhanced the music and sort of it definitely got me interested in Indian music, although not really. I'm sure the only guy I can name is Ravi Shankar. But he got me interested in Ravi Shankar, and then Ravi Shankar's wonderful daughter, Nora Jones, which is, yeah, funny. Yeah, I don't know. I can't. If I wanted to be thorough, I could talk to an actual Indian person and see how they felt, an actual sitar master, and see how they felt. But I'm not doing that because I don't work very hard at this. I'm just rambling about the goddamn Beatles because that's what I've chosen to do today. But yeah, Rubber Soul, Rubber Goddamn Soul. Of course, it has "Run for Your Life If You Can," Little Girl. It's a great song, you know. I'm sorry, it's got a real rhythm to it, you know. It's got, it's also got in my life, you know. Talk about, you know, the childhood sentiment, emotional memories, looking back, the wistful past of being English, you know. But it's not just being English. I think, you know, we all at times feel like the English, which is a terrible thing to admit. But, you know, I think we all are at some point just staring out at a little gray background, wishing we were in somewhere brighter and imagining that world, and then aggrandizing our few bright memories into these big events, you know, that comprise this world of fantastical creatures and characters in our mind. And so, yeah, I think that is sort of the quality to the Beatles that I really, more than anything else, it is that fantasy quality. Other bands, you know, are not about fantasy. Some bands are about acquainting you more with reality in a certain way, or that's sort of what punk ethos was in a lot of ways. It's like we're trying to escape that. I guess, you know, what punk was a reaction to more than a lot of other genres was prog rock, right? Which was about sort of too much of this fantasy. But, you know, the Ramones were obviously named for Paul McCartney. They were named for the fake name that Paul McCartney used in Germany. So, and they loved the fucking Beatles. They loved all that girl group music, which is what they based their sound heavily on, which is, at the end of the day, still a type of fantasy. But, I guess more appropriate than fantasy is sort of whimsy, sort of the escape from the mundane, from the gray, into like a world that is sort of more flamboyant. So, you know, how could I not like it as a young theatrical queer? It's young, and there's this, one of the gay aspects of it. We're talking about the gay Beatles a lot, but there were a lot of queerness around it. There was Brian Epstein, of course. Billy Preston was gay, and, you know, he didn't. I don't know if he came out in his lifetime. It was sad if he didn't, but of course everyone knows that the Beatles jacked off. They JO'd in front of each other in Hamburg because, you know, they were just mad out of their minds. They were mad lads on speed at the time, and they were just JO'ing in front of John. We have to JO in front of each other. Paul, I'm JO'ing as fast as possible. I don't know why. I find it funny them using that terminology. I don't know what they call it. We have to wank. We've got to do some wanking in Hamburg. We call it Wankberg because of how much we're wanking. We're on Preludin. We're taking all these prellies, so we're just staying up for 18 hours a day. We're playing songs for 9 hours of it, and then we're wanking for the other 9. We're JOing for the other 9 hours. But I also think, you know, there is a sort of a speaking of the early Hamburg days, there is a very homoerotic subtext to Stu Sutcliffe and John Lennon's relationship. You know, I think part of why John Lennon was also so fucked up is he felt responsible for Stu Sutcliffe's death. You know, one story about Stu Sutcliffe, he was a guy that played with them in Hamburg, sort of a brilliant visual artist, but less obvious musical charisma than the other fellas, and he sort of fell by the wayside and sort of quit the band and then died of, like, I forget what it was. It was like a hemorrhage or an aneurysm or something like that. But I think it was from an injury that he had sustained while they were out, like, kicking the shit out of people in Hamburg. They were going out, like, just trying to, like, raise heck and stomp trouble because they were, you know, no good. They were no good fucking teens, high on speed, and they were looking to start shit. And then Stu Sutcliffe retained an injury from that may have had something to do with his death, which I'm sure weighed on John Lennon. But every artist, there's a lot of great artists who have deaths weigh on them, Kanye and his mom, and in comparison. And I think it's weird when you become someone like the Beatles or Kanye, because then these become this is just, normal, mundane bullshit stuff in your life, but it somehow becomes part of this greater mythology that you've cultivated about yourself, which is sort of strange. And, something that the Beatles, I think, to their credit, shied away from. If you've seen the Get Back documentary, for being the most famous fucking people in the fucking world, they had a lot of humility, and they didn't seem like they really considered themselves to be the best musicians of all time. They had a lot of respect for what other people were doing. They were like, oh, did you hear what Clapton was doing? I mean, I sort of disrespect their love of Eric Clapton. I don't understand why they love Eric Clapton. No, Eric Clapton's fine. There's some good Clapton tunes. I mean, I always liked who was in his band, who else was in it. I mean, I like Cream more for Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker than Eric Clapton, but they had a lot of humility. They liked Tina Turner. They were always giving props to people they thought were great. So I think that's also a quality. Is sort of it made them, at least George and Ringo and Paul, sort of eminently likable, more than John Lennon, whose fame and whose sort of aggression and his obvious problems dealing with his mother's death at an early age and really affected him throughout his life. And just also another thing that colors the Beatles, which colors all the baby boomer English bands of that generation, is the fucking war. Of course, this sort of treacly fantasy sentiment was poised for this post-war attempt of awareness of peace. You had just been raised by a generation of people who were traumatized, who had seen the most inhuman things, imaginable. And, you're carrying all that weight from it. Boy, you're going to carry that weight a long time. And sort of, I think that necessary escape into fantasy and, as something John Lennon and the rest of and Ringo and everybody said, peace, 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 because they were born during bombing raids, their early childhoods and their lives were utterly connected to this sadness and grief and death that was part of this ongoing national tragedy. And that's the treacliness of the English is only met by their deep depression and their deep sadness and their melancholy. Fucking Radiohead and shit. So I guess I also want to talk about Abbey Road, because I've said my piece about Rubber Soul. If I had to choose one which I like more, it's probably Abbey Road, with Rubber Soul as a very close second. But Abbey Road is the one I've listened to the most. It's the one where I just love all the songs deeply in it. It's the one where, as a child, before I settle on Paul as an adult, Ringo, of course, was my favorite Beatle, because he's the Beatle you understand as a child. He was poised as the protagonist Beatle. And, now is a good time to talk about Ringo. Ringo is people want to downplay the contributions of Ringo. Let me tell you, Buster, the Beatles wouldn't have been any fucking where without Ringo, because what the Beatles were, they were more than just a band. They were these media figures. They were these these public characters. And there was no one that embodied that more than Ringo. He by far got the most fan mail. He was the star of all the movies. He was, the plots always hindered around Ringo. In Hard Day's Night, oh no, Ringo has left the building because he's been depressed by Paul's grandfather and we need to find Ringo. He's the protagonist of Help. They want to cut off Ringo's fingers. He's the protagonist of Yellow Submarine. He's the first one you're introduced to. And also, he's a necessary figure in the band because you have these three these otherworldly, fantastical songwriters. And then you have Ringo, who's the normal one. He's you. He's your self-insert character in the Beatles. He's like if you got to be in the Beatles. And that's why he's important. because, without that grounding figure, without that guy in there, then it just becomes three people who are sort of relatable, but will never be as relatable as Ringo, who during their trips to India, brought Heinz baked beans with him because he's such a little creature of comfort. He's just like us. He's short, just like me. So that's, as a kid, I liked Ringo for that reason. Because he was just poised as the protagonist Beatle. And I guess, they initially got their foot in the door because he, when he replaced Pete Best, he was by far the most famous out of all of them because he had played in the local outfit Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. And so everyone knew about fucking Ringo. And he had already cultivated this sort of character. He wore his fucking rings. He's this sort of cowboy guy. He was this sickly child that gained confidence from obtaining this country-ass cowboy persona, which is funny for an Englishman. It's I'm the English cowboy. It's funny thinking of an English. Who wants an English cowboy, And that's how you achieve your powers, this worship of these American Western figures, which is, a big part of the Beatles canon as well. Yeah, I really loved Octopus's Garden as a kid. That was probably my favorite Beatles song as a child. And then, over the course of time, I had a different favorite Beatles song. I think if I had to choose a favorite Beatles song, it's gotta be Tomorrow Never Knows, right? That's like the best fucking song ever. So like fucking ahead of their time and all that shit. Talk about all the Beatles sound collages. That is the one that everybody loves. It's hard. You need to defend Revolution 9 or Only a Northern Song. Nobody needs to defend Tomorrow Never Knows. It's just self-evidently the best fucking song of all time. The fucking drums, and that's Ringo drumming too. People didn't say Ringo was a good drummer. That's him drumming. Those fucking iconic drums, that's him. The fucking the bird sounds, the seagull noises, the reverse noises, the droning, the sort of cool melody, the distortion used over the voice. It's fucking Tomorrow Never Knows is clearly the fucking best. Also, Paperback Writer. Those are like my favorite Lennon song is Tomorrow Never Knows. My favorite McCartney song is Paperback Writer because it's a punk song. It's like a little driving ass punk song. It's got that energy to it. My favorite George Harrison song. This is gonna come out of left field, but I really like Old Brown Shoe. I think people don't like that one. That's a very overlooked Beatles song, but I just really love that middle part. It was that little guitar break in the middle. I think is so fucking cool. That's so good. That's so fucking good, George Harrison. You were very good at guitar. People try and overlook your guitar accomplishments, but you were very good at guitar. I guess people don't overlook. It's hard to overrate. It's hard to underrate or overrate the Beatles. They're rated. I think they're rated pretty effectively. They're pretty much known in the canon. I don't need to defend anything about them, but I still feel like I have to because I committed to talking about this for an hour. Or I guess more than an hour at this point. So what was the point of all this Beatles talk? Nothing, just to say that I love them. And there was something about, I think that sort of melancholic treacliness, which after World War II just made sense to the world somehow. That sort of call for that escape into fantasy, which also sort of defined the reality of the boomer hippie overindulgence. But I think, that's why it was popular and sort of remains into popular because of that sort of hopeless desire for a peace that can never really exist. So you're always grasping at these ghosts of fantasy, like Mean Mr. Mustard or, the pretty nurses selling poppies from the tray. That's what I like about the Beatles. And I hope you like the Beatles too, because they're good.